He told me something that just rings so true. He says, in God we trust, but all others show me the data. I'm going to get you every time on your data. You're not going to, there's going to be a hole in something. I'm going to look at your IFU and I'm going to find where you didn't follow it, and now you're going to be at fault.
Rising above the ultrasonic cleaners and the clanking of stainless steel are the ideas and voices that are changing an industry. You're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for people, processes and products that are improving our sterile processing world. Each week we speak with frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers and entrepreneurs with a common goal to help you fight dirty, every instrument, every time. Whether you're tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you did. Now turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go Beyond Clean.
This week on Beyond Clean, we speak with Michelle Sirex, Education Specialist, Surgical Processing at Overlake Medical Center and Clinics. The entire season dedicated to instrument tracking systems, and we're going to take a laser focus today on Decon. Where is the opportunity, Hank? How much more can we glean, and what kind of an impact would that have, not only in sterile processing, but throughout surgical services?
The question is, Justin, how do we fight dirty better? How do we fight dirty smarter? And I think we're going to talk about guns in this episode, but not the kind of guns that you maybe think. It's scanning the guns and how you can use those guns to save lives and to save lawsuits as well, or maybe save you from a lawsuit. So stay tuned. This is going to be a fun one.
I really like what you did there, Hank. We're going to be back shortly with Michelle Sirex, Education Specialist, Surgical Processing at Overlake Medical Center and Clinics. I'm Justin Poulin.
And I'm Hank Walsh.
From 17 Studios, you're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
Joining us now is Michelle Sirex, Education Specialist, Surgical Processing at Overlake Medical Center and Clinics. And we're going to be talking about scanning and documentation, but specifically in Decon, because this entire season is going to be about instrument tracking solutions. And so we're going to break it all down into little pieces. And so today we're really targeting Decon. So Michelle, before we get started, I would just love to hear about your background, not only in sterile processing and working as an educator, but specifically around utilizing instrument tracking systems.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. As far as my sterile processing experience, I have been in the field for 22 years, coming this year. I started off actually as a surgical tech in the OR and did not enjoy the OR experience. I was fortunate enough to be hired while I was in school for scrub techs to be a sterile processing tech, and got hired in my externship. And I have a love for the field, a passion for it. I've worked my way all the way up from Tech 1, Tech 2, Tech 3, supervisor, coordinator. I've run my own department, and I've been an educator now approximately for 2 years, and really found that that's where my passion lies. As far as my experience with tracking systems, for me in decontam especially, I feel like they're not utilized nearly as much as they could be and should be, specifically for, infection control purposes and tracking, how we've processed things and if we've processed things correctly and, all the different points that we're supposed to hit with our IFUs. And if there were to be an infection of some sort, how would we track that,
I do know. And it's one of those areas, like I did a lot of work in the instrument repair world. And I remember you'd get a needle holder and by me missing an insert. And then how do you take that back if it's discovered in Decon? I've always thought that was an area of opportunity, and we are absolutely going to be diving right into that in our conversation today, because I agree with you wholeheartedly. I wanted to make a comment though about your background, specifically as a surgical technologist, and you said, I was lucky enough to get an externship in sterile processing. And a lot of times we see surgical techs that are really using SPD as a way to get a job and then find their way back to the OR. And I just love that you went the other way and embraced the industry. So
yes, I was absolutely the opposite of that. I think it's because I was a patient with a post-op infection. And so I wanted to, first when, what got me into scrub tech school, it's funny, I had a car accident and I was broken from the waist down and didn't walk for a year. And I wanted to know how they fixed me. Well, after I learned how they fixed me, then it was like, okay, well, I had a post-op infection. Like, I want to really get into how can I make this better for other people? And that's why it's such an honor to work with you guys at Beyond Clean and Hank and to be able to be on this podcast, because to me, I feel like I'm kind of coming around full circle to be able to help educate. And it's very important to me, not only on a personal level, but just for our patients and as a whole, what we're doing and what Beyond Clean is doing is just amazing stuff. And I'm just so excited to be a part of it.
Well, I'll say I'm sorry that you went through that experience, but I love that your passion does come from a firsthand experience and really allows you to drive that. And I also want to acknowledge for people out there who may not be aware, you were talking about how you're working with Beyond Clean, but you're a member of the advisory group. So I wanted to thank you so much for taking another level of interest in Beyond Clean and contributing your passion to helping us continue to shape the industry, especially around education. And I wanted to get clarification on your role as an educator in your current department and how that relates to the tracking systems. Because in some institutions, I see the educator as the person who's responsible for the management and development and utilization of instrument tracking systems. And in others, they'll have a tracking system specialist that does that work. And maybe the educator does a lot of the training around, when new modules of the tracking system may be used, or just showing new employees and new hires how to utilize the tracking system. So do you have full oversight of the tracking system, or what's the structure where you are?
We are actually very fortunate in the fact that we have a company that we have partnered with, and they do a lot of our training for us, and they have online modules that they are able to watch. So I help facilitate that, but I'm mainly overseeing making sure we are following the standards, that people are trained correctly and onboarded correctly. And I also oversee all of the high-level disinfection for our GI endoscopy labs for our, large flexible colonoscopes, EGD scopes, things like that. So that's one of the big responsibilities that I hold as, overseeing that big part.
You mentioned, Michelle, that you're responsible for the standards and guidelines implemented in the department, which brings me to my little dream scenario here. So I want you to use your imagination a little bit, but maybe you won't have to use your imagination too much if you just use some experience, because I think many of us have had this experience. Pretend that you're a Joint Commission surveyor for a second, and you walk into a normal sterile processing decontamination area, and you want to find some low-hanging fruit, not the like super complex stuff that no one even think about, but just the basic things that every sterile processing decontamination area should be doing these things in terms of scanning and documentation. Where do you start? Like, what's that first couple of check marks is on your little sheet as you're walking in where you say, yeah, they're missing the boat here, or actually, hey, they're doing a great job on this point?
So I would say for sure for scanning when it hits decontam and when it hits, the sink, specifically for flexible scopes. If anybody knows, AMI, which is one of our governing boards, the Association of Advanced Medical Instrumentation, they're going to be coming out with AMI ST91 updates. And that's going to specifically, they're going to be addressing time that it takes from the time that it was used to the time it was pre-cleaned to the time that it went into, the sink to be washed. Because sometimes there is extended cleaning procedures that need to happen with those scopes if a certain amount of time has passed. And I would also say when it hits decontam, as far as looking at the instrumentation and the condition in which it's coming down, have they been doing point of use treatments? That's totally a big one. right?
We had an interview a few seasons ago with a couple of people that work in Virginia, and they were talking about a solution called RedCap that was tracking that. This is only the second time I've had a conversation with anybody really wanting to grab data and metrics around whether or not point of use was being done. And boy, what a great piece of information to share back to the OR educator.
Yes, absolutely. I actually work hand in hand with our nurse educator, and we're fortunate enough to have a very good relationship with our OR coordinators. So we have monthly meetings and we bring this stuff up and we work together collaboratively to educate not only the techs downstairs in sterile processing, but the nurses and the techs upstairs in the OR, because that point of use cleaning is so important. It's the very first step, They should be doing it on the field. AST, which is Association for Surgical Technology, and AORN, American Operating Room Nurse Association, I believe is what they stand for. They also state that you should be doing point of use cleaning and actually wiping those things down while you're on your back table and on your field. So it's really, really important to get that bioburden starting to be wiped off or broken down as soon as possible. It just makes cleaning so much harder if you don't. And that's one of the definite low-lying fruits I see for sure. And finding a way to capture a scan for that and find some data and build that would be something that I would like to start to incorporate into our data as we start to get people to scan more.
And yeah, that timing function too. Like I know we were talking about the pre-treatment, but you started with how long has this been sitting here? From the time it was used, to the time that decontamination actually starts. And boy, that is all over the map, depending on your facility, the caseload. It's really crazy. Like,
is it 9 o'clock in the morning or is it 3 o'clock in the afternoon when they're 50 carts deep,
Right. And do you have resources in sterile processing that can go and get those case carts, like physically, if they're just camping out outside the room or upstairs by the dumbwaiter?
Or break them down. Or break them down and start pre-treating them some way, like spraying them down as you're breaking them down. Somebody in Decontam capturing that. There's lots of ways to skin the cat.
All those have data points, to your point, and that's what's so important about this conversation. So speaking of data points, let's just say that we had a program in our decontamination area that we have a scan for non-compliance related to point of use cleaning, our pre-treatment. So let's just say that we have that scan, it's built in. Why do you feel like it's so hard to hardwire that process and that data gathering for our technicians? Where's the breakdown in your opinion?
For the surgical technicians or for the sterile processing technicians?
Let's do both. If we're asking the surgical techs to scan, you can speak to that, but I'm primarily thinking about on the sterile processing side because that's where that first, point of scanning could occur.
So I think the hardest and the biggest challenge is the pressure and the time to get things through. Do they have time to sit there and go to a computer and scan it and make sure everything is checked in? That's one of the biggest complaints I hear. Well, I don't have time. So I would say time is one of the biggest constraints. And we've got to find a way to, make this part of, the whole training process because, I have a friend who's an attorney and he told me something that just rings so true. He says, in God we trust, but all others show me the data. I'm going to get you every time on your data. You're not going to, there's going to be a hole in something. I'm going to look at your IFU and I'm going to find where you didn't follow it. And now you're going to be at fault.
What do you think in terms of our cultural training or, educating that technician to think through that legal perspective or that mindset? Like, do you feel like most technicians understand the critical importance of that scanning step to a potential lawsuit? Or if they do understand, do they just not care because they're like, that's the hospital's kind of problem to deal with, not mine personally? Like, is that a piece that our industry is just failing the onboarding for new technicians, or is it something else?
I don't think that anybody who gets into the sterile processing field wants to say, look, it's not my problem, it's the hospitals, and doesn't care. I absolutely don't think that that's the case at all. I think it's you don't know what you don't know. So for me, I think it would be more the onboarding and the respect the department and the industry as a whole as well, needs to have. We're not just dishwashers. And a lot of these people who come into our field are, either off the streets, fresh from school, or they're, coming from environmental services, maybe into sterile processing. And you've got to remind them that, this is very, very, very critically important things to make sure that you're doing it right. So I don't think that they think that far ahead. They're in the moment with the time trying to get things done, but I don't think in any way, shape, or form is it done out of like, oh, nope, that's on them, not my issue. No way. I don't think that's the case at all.
I want to take a moment here and just give a shout out to the audience, or maybe ask. Look, you mentioned that you had an attorney friend, and I don't know if they're in like medical negligence or anything like that, but I've wanted for a long time to talk to an attorney or two about this challenge, like about these kinds of lawsuits in particular. It's related to sterilization issues, TAR breakdown. So if there's anybody listening who is an attorney or knows an attorney that would come on the show with us, please email me at hank@beyondclean.net. I want to talk to you, and I want to tell this story through that lens of the attorney, because they've got their own vested interest in really diving into the data, to your point, to see, is it verified that all these steps actually took place? And is there a paper trail or data trail to prove it? And many times, I think we've talked about offline, Michelle, that if you know where to look, you can find holes in almost every department's data. I don't care how good you are. My department back in the day would have had holes in my data if you look close enough. And it's not because we're not trying, to your point, or that we're not caring. It's that there's really a breakdown in the available technology, the available time, the training for technicians, all of that's so true.
Mm-hmm. And training too. Some people, some of our techs are people who English is a second language, or they're older and have had to graduate into this technology that they didn't have before, because old school, we had the pen, paper, write everything down method, right? Some hospitals are still having that method, and they're at a huge disadvantage, in my opinion. But, they are intimidated by the computer, or they're, not sure. So, that I think also is something that's worth mentioning. And yeah, I think every single department, no matter where you go, if I came in and I went looking for some hole in data, I could immediately guarantee you I'd find it in Decontam for sure.
So it's interesting. The last episode we did an interview around manual tracking, and you were just talking about the importance of tracking systems. And we kind of identified, some positives of the manual system, meaning that everybody has to really learn the instruments to a very detailed level. And I'm certain that you learned a lot of instruments when you were in surgical technology school. So I kind of wanted to get your take on the tracking systems themselves and really around that manual piece. Do you think it also provides a crutch, or as an educator, have you found ways to make sure that that instrument knowledge is at a higher level just through the programs that you put together for new staff?
If the data is correct and your data is clean in your tracking system, then I think that it's a bit of a crutch. I had to learn the old-fashioned way where, here's an instrument, here's an iris scissor, its length is this, it comes in curved and straight. Gold-handled means carbide inserts on the tips. So I try to incorporate that into my teaching of new techs when they are on the assembly side. And in Decontam, I like to pop quiz and ask, randomly, what is this instrument? Name this instrument, so that they're not just depending on those numbers and they're actually looking at the instrument and what are these differences, because you are at a disadvantage if you just peek at those numbers and you're not really learning the instruments.
So looking back at that decontam workflow, right? Because we're talking about the scanning, and we've spent a fair amount of time on the pre-treatment side, on the timing side as the trays are coming in. But I would like you to walk us through the other key areas of the Decon workflow that can or should be scanned and documented to build that case, that compliance case or that legal case that we were referencing, to show that we did our due diligence from the moment the tray hit the door to the moment it came through on the other side of the washer.
So if I start from when it hits decontam, I would have a scan for when it was decontam received. I would have another scan for when it hit the sink as far as decontamination in the sink. If it required ultrasonic cleaning, I would have a scan for the ultrasonic cycle, whether it's a lumen cycle or a regular instrument cycle. I would have, at that point, if there was a manual cleaning there, I would have a scan for manual cleaning, and I would have a scan for our washers as well. For HLD cleaning, as specifically our scopes, I would love to see us utilize SPM, and that's my goal this year, is to build that into what we have now. When it hits our endo room, when it was a scan for when it was pre-cleaned, a scan for when it hit the endo room, a scan for when it hit the sink for manual cleaning, a scan for when it went into the AER, a scan for when it was, hung up in the closet, and also ATP testing on those. We're going to have to be doing lots more ATP testing, borescope inspections, possibly a scan on that.
That was going to be my follow-up. Yep.
Not only a scan, but maybe even capturing the actual image so that you can go back and educate specifically.
Yes, absolutely. I would love to have, there's several manufacturers out there that have the option where you have the camera and you can actually take a picture and you can see, okay, this red mark is a manufacturer's line. That right there is some methicone. And then they can identify these things and know, hey, and I think once we get these borescopes in and we really start looking at these things, it's going to be eye-opening at how much, we miss because we can't see down those tubes.
Right. What's interesting, I got a kind of a two-part question, I guess, here for you. You listed some very important key steps along that decontamination workflow. As you alluded to, it can go different pathways depending on the type of device it is and the required cleaning, etc. But, there's even more than what you mentioned. That was a very long list. There's things such as, hey, how can I prove that I brushed this lumen in the workflow unless there's a scan that I brushed? Or how can I prove that I used properly diluted chemicals in the manual cleaning stage? Like, you can prove that it went into the manual cleaning stage.
We are lucky in the point that there is a system that we have that actually captures the data of our dosing.
Right.
And we download that hard drive every day or every week. So we do capture that and we do have that. But yeah, for people who don't have that, absolutely. If they're having to manually dose, how do you prove that you did it to the correct concentration? How do you document that you did the right chemical?
Yeah.
For that matter.
Yeah, right. But my follow-up question, this is kind of practical. There's going to be a lot of texts listening to this saying, hold on a second. Michelle wants us to scan like 100 freaking times in Decon.
They have no time. No time.
I already don't have enough time, and she's telling me that I need to add like 20, 30 scans. What is the solution here? Because we got to tell a story. It's got to be compliant. It's got to be documented. But how do we bridge that practicality gap of 100 scans for a single tray?
That is a really, really hard question. And I don't have an answer for that. I think that as an industry as a whole, we've got to find a way to maybe figure out how do we add another person to decontam, to be the person who's, offloading those and scanning that there. Do we have guns to scan at every single point to make them easier and have the screens pulled right up? Is there a way we can automate it? I don't know the answer to that, but there's so many smart people and so many different industry experts out here. I'm sure it'll be a matter of time before somebody comes up with something that, will help that. But it is definitely a huge gap that we have, and it'll get us every time we go to court. Every time.
Yeah, I think there are technologies that are emerging out there that, we've been introduced to, like RFID or even that machine vision. So that might help solve, like you said, having a gun and having to actually point and shoot. Now, at the very beginning of the interview, we kind of teed this up and talked about how there was so much opportunity for getting scanning data in Decon. And so I also have a two-part question, but the first one's kind of a yes or no. I'm assuming that just based on what you said as we kick this all off, that you feel that the industry has largely ignored this area and focused more on assembly and sterilization across the board. Would you agree?
I would absolutely agree, specifically sterilization, because they worry about, is it sterile? Is it sterile? Is it sterile? Was it sterile? Did I have a biological? But they're not thinking about all the back end pieces, because you can sterilize something, but if it's dirty, it's not going to be sterile.
100%. Not clean, not sterile, same metric in terms of the impact on the outcome. So let me ask you this question then. Have you seen department leaders anywhere or spoken to, just as you're networking, obviously very active on LinkedIn and social media? Have you run into any department leaders, either worked with or come in contact with, that you feel like are doing a good job, not only collecting this data, but really reviewing it and putting it to use in terms of communicating either with internal stakeholders or surveyors, et cetera?
I think we're all, I've had conversations with many other department leaders and educators, and it's a question we're all throwing around and kind of trying to figure out an answer to. And it all boils down to being able to, it's not that they don't want to do it. It's a matter of being able to get have the ease of that for the technicians so that they can get those instruments through, so that the instruments ultimately get to the patient. I mean, we need to slow down, if I can be quite frank. We need to slow down. And unfortunately, in our industry and with COVID and the backlog of surgeries now, we're only going to get busier.
Yeah, there's a big strain going on in terms of workforce to be able to meet that too. So even if you got the budget holders to commit and say, yeah, we do need to do that. We need more bodies. We need to slow down. You might not be able to find the people to fill the open positions you created. So there's a catch-22 there. And I'm going to tie that into our last question as well. So we've talked a lot about the opportunity. We've talked a lot about the struggles in terms of just number of scans and the technology to keep up with that, and the workforce shortages that impact, even if we could set this ideal out in the departments across widely, spread out across the industry. So let's just go ahead and pretend that we're going to move towards that ideal and that it's going to be a perfect world at some point. Everybody's going to get it. Workforce issues are going to solve themselves. We're going to get people inspired about sterile processing and continue to recruit into the industry. If you were to just say, okay, now that I can have whatever I want, how would you build a dream technology, or what would that look like if you were to start from scratch? You're going to go be an entrepreneur. Some venture capitalist gave you $100 million, more than you would ever need, and all those other issues are solved. What things would you want to include that really would take this area from our conversation today to the next level?
Oh, wow. That's a loaded question. And wow. So many things. I would say a lot more technology as far as easier access to automatic, like, let me stick a picture while I'm in Decontam under this, and this is how you clean this. So that I can automatically, if I have something that come down to Decontam, what are my IFUs for this? How am I supposed to take care of this? And the time for people to take the time to be able to follow those standards, and the time to be able to have all of those scan points built in that we discussed throughout this podcast, to where that they get captured. And I guess to see the whole picture. Maybe if...
Yeah, and I almost feel like that instructions for use, if they could break it down into each step, so if they did recognize it, that there was a screen, and instead of seeing the entire instructions for use, just each step as you're going along.
Oh my goodness, that would be absolutely perfect. Like, yes, that would be amazing. If it could step by step, okay, I did this, press the touch screen, it goes to the next step. Okay, I did this, press the touch screen, it goes to the next. And if it captured that data in the system in the background to where it could be collectible and on a report, that would be even more amazing. Because then they wouldn't have to scan and do those things. It would be automatic, right? Yep, I did this, press the next button. I did this, press the next button.
And Justin, this kind of goes into cross-pollination to our power supply channel around healthcare supply chain. But we have a new expert over there, Vin Matozo, that's talking about interoperability. And a lot of the conversations we're talking with IFUs, there's crossover technologies at play here because we're talking tracking system, and then there's IFU databases, and then there's machine learning. And in thinking through the capabilities here, to Michelle's point, even something like I keep on harping on brushes, but something as simple as a cross-reference for our entire inventory. So if we've got a product number in our inventory that requires a brush, it should spit out all the brushes, all the sizes, diameters, etc., that we need to compliantly clean everything in our inventory. That is not an unreasonable ask with the amount of data that we have, but no one's built it, to my knowledge, even though the potential is here. So, Michelle, if you win the lottery or if you get that venture capitalist thing, add that into your solution, please.
Absolutely. And if we could have a way to make all these systems integrate and talk to each other, right? That would be amazing.
That's really what Vin is talking about, is getting interoperability between one system and another, just like Hank suggested, and you tied up really nicely at the end there. If we could streamline that so there wasn't a manual handoff, how valuable would that be to get a truly end-to-end solution? Michelle, you did a phenomenal job in this interview, and I want to thank you again for being part of our Beyond Clean advisory group and participating in conferences. I just love how much you're contributing to the voice of sterile processing here at Beyond Clean, and then everything you do outside of your activities with Beyond Clean, not only in your current role, but professionally as well. So I really enjoyed talking with you today, and I want to thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much as well. I had a great time, and I look forward to more opportunities and helping make the sterile processing world a better place.
That was Michelle Sirex, Education Specialist, Surgical Processing at Overlake Medical Center and Clinics. And Hank, I love this interview specifically because not only did we talk about tracking systems and the emphasis in getting additional data, useful data in Decon, but also the fact that her practice is widely applied to include clinics and flexible scopes. And I think sometimes when we talk about tracking systems, we don't always incorporate the data that's being collected around flexible scopes. And you talk about an area, especially related to Decon, tie those two together. And there's a lot of reportable data points that we aren't necessarily capturing today that can really help improve the quality and the communication as we go back to point of use cleaning and documenting that could be very helpful to just drive quality in surgery.
I think I've shared before, Justin, that I quit law school in my second year, but I never quit caring about the impact of the law in terms of sterile processing. And so when we talk about getting sued and malpractice and the ideas of negligence, like all of that is real life, guys. I cannot drill that in enough. Hospitals are getting sued all the time. And I know we're a litigious country here in the U.S. and probably even across the globe. There's all kinds of lawsuits that happen, and there's good lawsuits and there's bad lawsuits. But at the end of the day, if a lawsuit happens, that means something went wrong. And to Michelle's point in this interview, attorneys are going to be digging into every piece of documentation they can get their hands on. And we owe it to ourselves, our hospitals, and the patient to leave as good of a trail behind us that shows we did what was supposed to have been done, and we did it at the right time, in the right way, and by the right person to show that that standard of care is there. So this is no joke. It's not something that happens to somebody else. Attorneys look at this data. It's very, very important that you do what you need to do to capture it, especially in decontam.
All right. Well, that's going to do it for this episode. I want to remind everyone that you can support Beyond Clean by subscribing on Apple, Amazon, or Google Podcasts. We're on other podcast applications as well, like Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify. And if you have another podcast app that's your favorite, you can simply search for the Beyond Clean podcast there. But the best way, in my opinion, is the smartphone app. And even on this interview, after we got done recording, Michelle told us that she tells everybody to download the Beyond Clean smartphone app. And what's great about that is it's available for iPhone and Android. It has all of our podcasts categorized, and many of them have bonus content that's been uploaded. You just click on that gift box and that'll pop it up. And while you're there downloading the app, we'd love a rating and a review because your feedback is important to all of us here at Beyond Clean. Finally, if you have any topics that you'd like us to cover in the future, just send an email to info@beyondclean.net. And on behalf of Hank and myself, thank you for listening to this week's episode of Beyond Clean.